Great morning, everybody. So excited to be with you this morning for our BMG. Today's topic is on the 6 human fears. Got a couple more people popping in right now. So this is on the 6 human fears. Again, everybody should have received the PDF last night. If you can go ahead and print that out or pull it up on your screen, that's going to be our roadmap for the whole thing today. That's something that you can print and keep with you. Going to be a really, really powerful tool, again, to give you that visual trigger to help you pull yourself back. So you guys know I love my stories. A couple of you have already heard this story, so bear with me if you have before, but this is a true story and this always hits home. This is one of those moments that it's something that was a real life experience for me, and it just really resonates with people in terms of comprehending fear. So I want to illustrate something with you really quickly. This all takes place in Baltimore, Maryland, and this was many years ago. So my mom actually worked and still works for an insurance company, and often in order for them to claim insurability on a house, they'd have to get pictures of the front and the back of the house. Well, they were located, an hour outside of Baltimore, and truthfully, none of the employees wanted to go and take pictures in Baltimore. So I was the lucky guy. So I got to go into Baltimore, and I met this young man, and we're walking down the sidewalk one day. And Marlene, I know you know this story. Don't laugh at me. But I'm walking down the sidewalk one day, and I met this young man, and he starts telling me about how he has 2 different journeys that he can travel to get home. He's got one journey that is only about 10-15 minute walk. The other journey is a 45-minute walk. But the 10-15 minute walk, he gets chased by a ferocious pit bull every time. And he admitted to me that he was deathly afraid of dogs. He was attacked when he was a kid. So has anybody in here seen Step Brothers? You guys know the scene I'm talking about where they're like, yeah, let's go home, but let's take this longer route. He's like, but Brennan, that's like 50 minutes. Let's go the short route. They're just a bunch of kids. This is what it reminds me of. So anyway, he's telling me about how he was been attacked by this pit bull multiple times. And so he's illustrating the day that everything for him changed. He's walking down this road, the short path, and just like every other time, the pit bull starts to chase him. And just like every other time, he starts to run as fast as he can. So he starts running down the sidewalk, and as he gets halfway down the sidewalk, he sees a loose brick on the side. And he reminds himself, no, today is my day. I am going to face these fears. So he grabs the brick, turns around to strike the dog, and realizes the dog has no teeth, not even one. And this is a perfect representation of the way that we interpret fears, because often what happens is we conjure up our own emotional interpretations of a scenario, and then we reinforce that interpretation through time. Then what happens? It becomes our pattern or our identity. But often, just like the dog, it's a scenario that is this toothless dog. We conjure up all these fears or potential outcomes that never occur. So I want you to think about that and keep that in mind when we start to dive into these fears. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys. Again, you should have this already, but go ahead and pull this up on your screen. And I really like this Dale Carnegie quote, and that kind of goes back to what we just said. Do the thing you fear to do and keep on doing it. That is the quickest and surest way ever yet discovered to conquer fear, which is so true. So let's dive into these. Now I'll stop at each one. So if you have questions or you have a story that you would like us to run through this, we can absolutely do that. Number 1, fear of poverty. Anybody been here before? This one is the most destructive and possibly the most difficult fear to master. Here's a visual that I really like for this. You can think of this like a river, okay? So imagine that you are in your own canoe and it's just you, and you have your oar and you're going down this river. And at some point, the river splits. You've got 2 different directions. You can choose the one to the left, which is poverty, or you can choose the path to the right, which are riches. here's the thing. Usually throughout life, we operate on both sides. We make decisions that would lead to poverty, and we make decisions that would lead to wealth. But at some point, one of those sides is going to take reign and be the dominant force. The great part is it's ultimately up to your control. So I'm just curious in the group really quickly, does anybody have a good definition of money, or how would you describe what money is to a complete stranger? And just shout it out. I can't see everybody, so.
It's basically a method to pay for goods and services.
100%. Absolutely right. Anybody else have a different definition or anything that they would like to add to the concept of money? Here's the thing, guys.
Money. Oh,
Go ahead. I want to hear you.
I think money is in a way like an opportunity card. And it's an opportunity card with some value that in some way or another, we've all agreed that, you know, if you have this many opportunity cards, then it affords you this sort of opportunity.
Absolutely. So for those that just jumped in, we're starting on the fear of poverty and we're defining money. And so all great descriptions. Matt, Miles, thank you guys. To me, money is simply a common denominator for the exchange of goods, right? That's the simplest way that I can define it. And so think about it like this. If 100 years ago, you wanted to trade a goat for 10 chickens, well, you're not going to continuously carry around a goat and chickens every time that you want to trade, right? So this was a common denominator, like Miles said, that everybody agreed on, that we could just exchange for a good. So when you break down the concept of money, it really doesn't take that much reign over you. But again, I'm curious if anybody is currently or has in the past ever had to face the fear of poverty. Everybody's hands should have gone up, right? We've all been there. So real quick, if you are currently living this, or if you have in the past, go ahead and jot your answer down. Is anybody bold enough to share theirs yet? And we're going to run through the equation at the end here, but I'm just curious if anybody has something they want to interject here. A story, an experience, and you don't have to, but just curious. No? Okay, cool. So let's go to the next one.
No, of course I will.
Okay, go ahead.
You know I will. So, when I first got out of college and I was married and started having children, I didn't make enough. I was in a career path that would make no money. I was a social worker in New York City working for Catholic Charities. And I guess you would consider I was poor and in poverty because I had to go on welfare in order to be able to buy diapers and cheese. I got government cheese and all that kind of good stuff. We did that for about a year.
I appreciate the vulnerability. So it's interesting you bring that up, Bob, because often we are in a moral dilemma where we have the intention of a good cause, but it doesn't always create the most income. And sometimes the opposite of that is true. We seek that income so much and we forget that there's good cause behind it. So I'm just curious, in that scenario that you just shared, Bob, how did that make you feel at the time?
You really want to know?
Yeah.
It broke me down.
100%.
As a man, I cried for a full day. I can remember when my wife was gone and it was just my son and I, and he must have been about 6 months old. And that's the day I came to realize who I am at that point. I was 25 years old on a career that I had committed myself to. I will not be able to feed this child. I just can't. And I cried that entire day with him in my arms. I remember that like it was yesterday.
That's tough. That's
and
tough.
I realized, and for everybody else here, it's one of my favorite words. I realized the world is fucked up.
100%.
Here I am doing what I know is the right thing for me to do, and I can't even feed my family.
That's where the worry, the doubt, the anxiety, all of these things start to bleed in, right? The truth is that, again, if you use that visual, when you're going down your river, you've got the choice. You either go down one side or you go down the other side. it's not as easy as just saying, okay, well, I'm in my canoe, I'm going to go to the right side, and now I have all these riches. But it's continuing to choose that path of the two. So, Bob, I just want to recognize you for your vulnerability. I really appreciate you sharing that story. I know it's very tough, right? A lot of emotions involved in this stuff, guys. And that's another thing we have to understand is that when emotions are high, logic is low. So what we want to do is we want to reverse that. We want to start to increase the logic and reduce the emotion so we are not reactionary to this, right? Because again, at the end of the day, money's just a human construct. So it gives as much weight over you as you allow it to, right? We're going to go through solving these at the end. So next one, fear of criticism. This one is huge. We often see this, now the thing about money is that when you're a child, you don't really have a concept over this. So you don't necessarily fear money. But when you get into your teens, your 20s, and later in life, that's absolutely real. The fear of criticism, this is one that's aged regardless. At any point in time, you will experience this. So a lot of people are extremely uncomfortable when they are receiving any form of criticism. What will other people say and what will other people think are the 10 most dangerous words in the human language. The alternative to this is constructive feedback, and a very powerful way that we can offer constructive feedback without it being super critical is by simply asking a question. Hey, Miles, would you mind if I gave you a little bit of feedback on that? Okay, cool. That is more constructive than critical, right? I'm opening the doors by asking if it's okay to give that thought. By the way, he could say, no, I don't really care what you have to say. Perfectly fine. Anybody currently or in the past experienced the fear of criticism?
Oh, yeah.
Does anybody have a story they'd like to share here of a moment in your life where you experienced this and it's stuck with you ever since?
I don't have the story of a moment, but more so just to share the perspective that I've grown to view this with is I think often when we have the fear of criticism, it's because there's this story about ourselves that we're trying to have other people believe. And we are scared that in whatever action I just took, people might not believe that story. People might put a different story on me, and I don't want that story to be on me. And instead of focusing on just being whoever you are and expressing yourself, your genuine self, you're now trying to fit into this role of a story that nobody ever even told, but is just all in your imagination. But it's a really loud story at the same time. So trying to break free of those expectations that you sort of give other people for yourself is, yeah, I'm not sure how to close that off, but those are my thoughts on this.
No, that was great. And that goes back to the dog again, right? It's all this fear that we give to the dog that we conjure up. And then when we actually face the fear, we realize that it didn't even have teeth in the first place. Now, that's not always the scenario, but majority of the time it is. Another thing that you brought up that's really important, Miles, is reflecting on the fear of criticism. You have to realize that you are the only person that goes to sleep with all your thoughts, character measurement, and interpretations. You are the only person that wakes up with those same thoughts. You are the only person that you need to satisfy and please. You are the only person that needs to hold your character to a particular level and make that judgment. It doesn't matter what anybody else says or thinks. They have their own stuff going on. And there's one more thing that you said, Miles, that I think is really important, is that when we get into these patterns, there's a loop. And if we hit that emotional loop, it's like a Matchbox car. Does anybody know what I'm talking about, where they used to have those tracks and you'd put the car in and it would go really fast and then it would slow down and then it'd hit that little guy and then it would just speed up again? That's the emotional loop, and we feed that loop and we feed that emotion. You have to realize that whatever triggers your emotional response is not about the trigger itself. It's about isolating that emotion and understanding where that emotion comes from. So anyway, well, go ahead, Bob.
Right. Yeah, so the other thing that brings up is this innate thing that we have of not standing out. That's the thing. So Miles is getting around. You know, you're going to stand out. You're going to be criticized, and for sure, standing out, especially throughout our whole history, if you stand out, you're not only going to get criticized, you can get killed. I mean, that's what the whole herd mentality, right?
Yeah.
A zebra, all zebras want stripes because then it's hard to see an individual zebra to strike them. If you look different than all the other zebras, it's easy to find you to kill you. So criticism, I think for me, it's the same thing, a fear of standing out, being your own person, like Miles says, saying something that no one else could say other than you. There's a fear of doing that because you're going to stand out and be criticized. Today's environment is criticized, not being killed, but criticized.
You're absolutely
Yeah, I
right.
have a good example too, if you don't mind me jumping
Go
in
ahead.
too. So I played college baseball and I was a pitcher. So pitcher, you have to be basically perfect every single time you go out there. And as I got to the college level, so many eyes are on you. You want to make it big. You have competition left and right. If you don't act perfectly in the moment, you will get benched. So it was a lot of pressure. And I don't know if anybody's ever heard of something called the yips in baseball, where it's like you don't know where the ball's gonna go because you're so in your head. And it's a thing in basketball too with the free throw line. It's the same thing. It's like something that could be so easy to some people. You mentally like kind of almost forget because your body can't do it. It's one of the weirdest things that happened to me in a game. It was very scary, but the root of the thought was I was being criticized by everybody else. If I didn't act a certain way, I didn't throw the ball perfectly, everyone would hate me. And I had this experience. I was going through it a lot and just like would do mental training every day. Like it was a big deal for me. But I had this realization when someone else that was pitching one day I was sitting on the bench and watching them, and they struggled big time and they had a tough day and they're all over the place, but nobody criticized them. And I recognized in that moment that nobody cares but yourself. And it wasn't like this giant deal. Oh my God, Jack isn't throwing over the plate. What a loser. And that was all was going on in my head. And I realized that guy's got talent, but he's just having a tough day. And it kind of got me out of that loop. And it was a very good experience. And that he wasn't like this enemy that I've created in my head that if I don't act perfect, I'm not good enough. So I definitely have dealt with that. And I think it relates here.
Great story, Jack. Thank you for sharing, brother. Yeah, I think
Let me also, I want to chime in something as well about what Jack said. Humans, for whatever reason, we have this misconception of perfection and that we should always be right all time and never make a mistake and always succeed and never fail. And so even though people know that that's unrealistic in a lot of situations, that's always strived for. And I think that's a big human flaw that is exasperated now, especially by social media. And so that's one of the things of criticism is not being perfect and making a mistake, and then the fear of criticism of that mistake, even though it's not intentional. And so that's a human and sociological aspect of why people like Jack in those high pressure situations are having those issues and feeling that way because of what society deems perfection should be. For example, you got to hit 1,000, and be able to have a perfect game and always throw a strike and never throw a foul ball or walk a player. And that's just not realistic. I mean, even Babe Ruth, which was one of the best baseball players ever, only hit the ball a third of a time. Was he a loser because he only hit the ball a third of the time? So it's the same concept there.
absolutely, guys. Yeah, and really what everybody's touching on is that how often do we do things because of societal influences or pressure? COVID's a perfect example of this. And look, I'm not trying to get into politics, but you can agree or disagree with the COVID vaccine, right? It doesn't really matter where you lie. But how difficult was it or is it for somebody that didn't want to get the vaccine? You've got societal influence and pressure. You've got it from the workplace. You've got it from family, the government. Like people were putting all this pressure. And this comes back to what everybody's talking about right now. societal influence or expectation, and we are geared because of what somebody else is going to think or say about us. And just like Jack alluded to, often nobody else cares, right? Because they're sitting there thinking the exact same thing about everybody else. Oh, these other people might be judging me. And everybody's sitting there thinking the same thing. So moving to the next one real quick, and we're going to break these down, but just to be conscious of time. So number 3 is the fear of poor health. Now, again, this goes back to the COVID example, but the interesting thing about poor health is that we experience this at different intervals. When you're in your youth, when you're in your teens, 20s, you can have a small injury and bounce back really quickly, right? But often when you are in your youth, we take our health for granted, and we don't really consider what we do have until we don't have it anymore. For example, tore a rotator cuff, and before that, I just went about my day. I put a lot of pressure on my body in the gym, but then when I tore the rotator cuff, I was disabled from a lot of the lifts. And so again, taking it for granted. Then when we get into our older years, we fear that this might be taken away from us again because of age, genetics, whatever it might be. So the fear of poor health comes up pretty frequently, but you experience it in different ways throughout your life, depending on where you are. Anybody have a story or anything they'd like to share on this in terms of poor health?
Keegan, good morning. Good morning,
Morning.
everyone. This is Marlene. This hit me year before last. I had a come to Jesus talk with Marlene, and I realized that I was at a crucial point that if I didn't do something, I was going to surpass my top weight. I knew it. And so here I am, a year and a half, almost 2 years later, and I've been able to keep 60 pounds off. So now my goal is to break through and to continue dropping, because again, I'm not in my 20s anymore. I like to tell everybody I'm in my 50s, but I done fell into my 60s. So life changes. So yeah, it can be a very pivotal, strong, all of a sudden you're right there, and it's a very black and white moment, and you have the opportunity of choosing what path you're going to walk.
Well said. Thank you for sharing, Marlene. Yeah, and it's such a relevant disruption when it does occur, right? It's when it throws you off, it can just throw everything off, and then you might not take certain chances because you're worried that, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to my health? I used to have a really good friend that he was a phenomenal street fighter, but he was terrified of training in the gym in an octagon or a ring because of the poor health. He was like, oh, well, if this happens, I'm out forever. I'm like, yeah, but you go out into the streets and fight where it's not regulated at all. So like you're already doing it. But anyway, the fear of poor health is relevant. And again, at different intervals for different people. Going to the next one, the fear of loss of love. This one is one of the most painful for sure. So this comes up in a lot of different ways. Often it is geared around family, around an influence in our circle as we grow up. So maybe like a friend of the family, for example, or a pastor, for example, somebody like that. And especially romantic relationships, right? And even really deep, intimate relationships that are friends. The fear of loss of love it's a powerful one. This one is probably one of my personal biggest fears based on the upbringing in youth, but it's something that you really have to conquer. And when we talk about emotions being heightened and logic being low, this is where emotion takes over, probably one of the most of all the fears, because love is an emotional reaction, right? Like we don't necessarily need to love to survive, although there's reproduction, of course, but we don't necessarily need that emotional content. So this one's huge. Has anybody else experienced this? Fear of loss of love? Anybody have a story they'd like to share here?
I'll share my story. In terms of the loss of love, throughout my life, I've always had conditional love. And so coming from a family of narcissists, when you're the only empathetic one, you really are the black sheep of the family. Me. So with that being said, I don't speak to my parents anymore because of the fact that my, stepmom is the drama queen and will sit there and start fights. And then at that point, blame you for defending yourself. And then my dad is pussy whipped and would sit there and go take her side. And so I haven't spoken to my dad and my stepmom in probably a year and a half or 2 years. So it was tough to have to break away from my parents, knowing they're in bad health, because of the fact that dealing with them, I was always walking on eggshells. And then with my mom, biological mother, she was one of these people that never should have had children. As far as I'm concerned, I should not be here between my dad and my mom. So when you have family, at least, them, at least my brother, who actually is there for me, but my sister I don't even speak to. So when you have most of your family that isn't there, the fear of the loss of love is ever present. And so even, self-love or things like that is tough to find, because the benchmark for having that love from your family, or at least the intermediate ones, was not there. It was conditional. It said, Matt, you had to jump through these certain hoops to get my attention and validation. And if you didn't, then you were criticized or chastised or, exonerated or basically, basically castrated from the family. And so it was always a mental game to try to get that. And that sucked. And I had to come to terms with that loss, because my family is that fucked up. And I had to learn what not to do, and more importantly, not how to treat people, but also the fact that their form of love was not unconditional. And it took me a long time to get that. I heard very interesting saying that the people in therapy are there because of people that will not get therapy or not acknowledge therapy. So and of course, this has affected me in my adult life, but it made me a better person to realize I don't want to go down that road. I don't want to go down the road that my parents went through and make the mistakes that they did and have no clairvoyance to have the accountability, responsibility, or more importantly, the humility to sit there and say, you know what? I should have done things differently. I shouldn't treat people like that. And so it really humbles you when
Absolutely.
Your family isn't there and then you become your own family, so unfortunately,
Yep.
so to speak.
Well, Matt, I appreciate the vulnerability, right? I think that a lot of people experience this in different ways, but the truth is at the end of the day, we can't choose our family, right? We're born into our family. I'm really curious from the group, does anybody have any feedback? So anything from Matt that you would offer up, because really what we're saying here and what we talked about at the beginning, again, back to the Dale Carnegie quote, the quickest and surest way ever yet discovered to conquer fear, you got to do what you're afraid of, right? So in this content, I'm really curious if anybody has feedback for Matt or just any thoughts here.
Matt, the only thing I have for Matt, I mean, I honor and I see it, and I know the courage that you've got, that you have had to muster and overcome everything and become the person that you are. And the little bit that I've gotten to know you, I just appreciate your courage to stand against all of that. You're quite a man. You're quite a person. I appreciate
Well, thank you. I mean,
so much.
to me, if the Cowardly Lion could do it in Wizard of Oz, then why can't I? So, but it's the fact that you have to realize, I mean, and Keegan and I have, discussed this as well, is you have to look at the world around you. You can't have this linear tunnel vision where it's only, you in front of you. You have to have that VR 360 view. And so one of the things that I personally do, and I hope that this helps everybody else in the group, is every day I reflect and I say, what is the takeaway? And you basically give yourself like a summary, or if you're watching like sports or like wrestling, you have your own color commentary. Say, okay, what is everything I accomplished today? What did I not accomplish? And how did I end the day? And what is the takeaway from today? So I know what to work on tomorrow. And that's one thing that I realized with my parents. It was so hard not to sit there and to, have my mom and my stepmom and my dad in my life, because I was they were there for me, especially when I was younger in certain ways. And so to cut off parents because of their abuse, it sucks. I mean, it isn't like, Dyson vacuum cleaner sucking or maybe like hooker sucking, but it is definitely up there. And so considering that there's so few people in this world that actually should be there for you, which is your family, to not have that is disheartening. But it also realized that, okay, I need to find that unconditional love or validation from other people. So even if somebody's not biologically related to you, it doesn't mean that they can't sit there and love you unconditionally. For example, my parents' dog, that's the only female ever loved me unconditionally. That dog would come at me like a 15-year-old going after Justin Bieber. And it was just great. And so I missed that dog. She would lick you and check for disease at the same time. And so just because it isn't maybe a human, companion, it could be a four-legged companion. But ultimately, if you have love to offer, you have to find people to channel that love to, that want to reciprocate unconditionally, if possible.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So just to close out this fear, go ahead.
Yeah, just something quickly in the interest of time. Where you were closing off with that, Matt, where you could find love even in the dog and the love that the dog gives you. I think it was the Sufi mystics, like long ago, who had this tradition and a poem where they would say, I found the love of other human beings, but I didn't experience freedom until I found the love coming to me from the wind. And I felt the love coming down to me from the sun every morning. And so in this strange way, we can discover love just around the world and sort of embrace ourselves within that. And sometimes it's a really nice place to go when it feels challenging or difficult to find that love that we're seeking in other people.
Well said, Miles.
Yeah, because I always thought, like, okay, my parents, that's like the Rock of Gibraltar. That's where it starts. The problem is that if that was where it didn't start and you think it started, because that's what happens with most people, most families, you have to learn to find elsewhere. And it took me a long time to have a frozen moment and let it go, to say, okay, my parents are not the source, even though they should have been. Where can I find it elsewhere? And that was definitely, an epiphany to have that thought and that mentality.
Absolutely. So, and Matt, one thing I want to be really clear on is that we have to look inwardly before we look outwardly. You're never going to go out into the world and find that love or that validation from others if you don't first start with giving it to yourself. That is the biggest step. And so we'll come back to this and we'll talk through the equation as well. But again, just for sake of time, let's go to the next one. So, and thank you for your vulnerability. For the fear of old age, this one's really interesting to me because you'll see the last two almost parallel in a way. In the fear of old age, when you are 5 years old, this is something that never crosses your mind, right? When you get into your teens, you probably still aren't thinking about it. 20s, probably don't really think about it. 30s, maybe. 40s, maybe. I don't know. But the fear of old age is usually a fear that comes up because we have lost physical or economic freedom. Okay, so specifically, when you are getting into your older years, if you ever have to have the conversation about a nursing home, for example, that is economic and physical reduction of freedom, right? That's something that people fear. Nobody wants to be put into a home, right? But there's also this sexual component when we get older, and sometimes people, they lose that aspect, right? If you are an attractive young individual, the older you get, you might fear that might go away, whether it does or not. The fear of old age is often relevant in our older years, though. I'm curious if anybody has any thoughts, feedback, or experience on this or personal story here.
Actually, I have something I'd like to share, and I'm going to combine the fear of old age and the fear of death. I feel personally that I am a very fortunate person because I don't have extreme fear of these. And the reason being, I just lost my 90-year-old father on August the 14th. He passed in his sleep. I had actually prayed about that because my mother, my 83-year-old mother, was going to have a very difficult time letting him go because they had been together Their 64th wedding anniversary was August 23rd. And because of all of the leap years, they made the 64 years. When I look at this, and I remember standing by my father's bed and talking to him, it reminds me that even though I've walked very rough paths, I've had a very fortunate life. And I rather make the best of every day, every minute, and every second that I have going forward, so that when my day comes, my family will not fear it either. So I hope that helps somebody.
Thank you for your truth, Marlene. Here's, and we'll get into the fear of death as well. I understand why you lap those two together. It totally makes sense. And they go together, right? But real quick, does anybody else have any thoughts or stories or examples on the fear of old age before we go to the fear of death?
I'll share.
Okay.
I'm not feeling so great, so excuse me, and I'm losing my voice, but so my family, like all the generations, they all had children and married very, very young, and which has been incredible for me as an adult. I'm 40 years old and still have both my grandmothers, my parents, all my aunts and uncles, haven't had to experience death very much at all. And I'm seeing, you know, all of these generations reach up into elderly ages as I'm an adult. But I waited till later in life to have my daughter, and she's about to be 6. So I had her when I was 34. And as much as I wanted to wait, because I felt like if I got myself grounded and had my career under my feet and was more financially stable, I could give her a better life. But it's kind of a catch-22, because now I'm realizing that I'm not going to have as much time with her, or she won't have that time with my parents that I got to have. So it's kind of hitting me a little bit. That as much as I wanted to take a different path and waiting to have a family, I kind of took for granted that my parents gave me a lot of time by choosing the path that they did, that I might not be able to afford my daughter. So I'm starting to feel like, you know, when she's my age, I'm going to probably be nursing home age, which is weird because my parents are nowhere close to nursing home age. So I don't know. I think that the thoughts are creeping in that I didn't really think about until this conversation started. So it's a little crazy.
Yeah, thank you for your truth there, Carissa. That's a tough one. And one thing that I'll share with you is that based on the story you just shared with us, conditions are never perfect. Conditions are never perfect. And often we go throughout life seeking the right time to act. When I have this, when I get to this point, then I'll do this. That's a really good example, right? So in your particular story there, it is, well, when I have the house, when I have the financial freedom, then I'll have the kid, right? And so I'm not picking on you, by the way, but my point is that often, and this is human nature, this isn't just a Carissa thing, right? We all do this, but a lot of times we get into situations where we wait to act. And that goes back to, I don't think everybody was able to hear this, but I received a text last night about being proactive versus reactive. Well, that's part of what you just shared, is you have to realize that when you can understand and conceptualize the fact that, look, the stars are never going to be perfectly aligned, then it helps you wait from waiting or being proactive, and you just act. Because like John C. Maxwell said, there's two types of people. There's a type of person that waits until they feel a certain way to act. And there's the type of person that acts a certain way so they know they'll feel a particular way after doing it. The only problem with the person that waits is they don't get the results they want because they're always waiting for the right time and it never shows up. Again, I'm not picking on you. I love the story. And this is a really good transition to the fear of death, because I've done a lot of research on the psychology side. This is revered as the largest human fear. Of all fears that are out there, this is the number one fear. Why? Everybody faces it. It's inescapable. You know, some of the other ones you may not experience. This one, everybody experiences, right? You have to. So there's a couple truths here. And the interesting thing to me is that, again, when we talk through some of the stories that everybody's sharing and hearing all these different perspectives and different takes on it, a lot of times we wait until the situation presents itself as a threat for us to act, right? We wait until our health gets out of control for us to act. We wait until our finances are really poor, and then it forces us to act. What I'm really saying is often we wait until a crisis occurs to force us into action instead of acting before we're forced into a crisis. And that's the thing about the fear of death. I know so many people that whenever we start on a coaching program, it is, you got to look at the 8 categories. We got to define these. And one of those is spirituality. And often younger people, if they are not already in a spiritual world, they have no interest in incorporating this. Why? Because the fear of death isn't relevant yet. And then guess what happens? You get into your 50s, your 60s, your 70s, and you're scrambling to have some spiritual component, whether that's religion or not. People are seeking the answer and the comprehension. The whole point of this, guys, is you want to tackle these things before they grow and expand into these monsters, into that pit bull that's going to chase you down the road. You want to act before you get to that point. So I love the story that Marlene shared, and Carissa, the one that you shared is absolutely relevant to this as well, right? It's, I'm raising a child that I want to make sure I'm around for. I want to be there when she hits those maturity ages and we can have real conversation and really get to know and understand each other. Like, there's so much gold in that. And that might be taken away from me because of this inescapable truth that we all face. So again, I'm curious if anybody has any stories or anything relevant to the fear of death that you'd like to share.
I'll chime in with something. One thing that I've noticed that as I gotten older is that there are more people dying. And so that is very humbling, especially because of my clientele. A lot of them are older. And when you grow bonds with those people, and unfortunately they pass, I mean, it's almost like a piece of you dies with them. And so that is very humbling to sit there and say our time on this planet is very finite. And so I agree with what Marlene said about, living, the most of every day, because you don't know what is guaranteed tomorrow. And so the more the people are not in your life because they get older, more that you think about it, because it's at some point, it's like John Cena, my time is now. And so that's kind of how it is when it comes to dying. We can't avoid it. Nobody has found, the fountain of youth in Ponce de Leon. And so when it happens to other people, it's there, but also it helps to reinforce, okay, I need to get my shit together. I need to do more with my life because this person passed. For example, I lost a friend in the Surfside collapse when the building went down. I mean, what's the likelihood of that? But it happened. And so that to me was my 9/11. And to go through that is really fucked up. And so that every year in June is a reminder of death and that nothing is guaranteed tomorrow. So when you go through that major trauma of something of that caliber, it changes your life forever. And you're never the same, but also makes you appreciate the people that are there, the situations that you're involved with, the memories you make, and you have your Instagram moments. All that is exemplified because of the fact that you've, have had to hit rock bottom and not like Dwayne Johnson at all. And so that has also occurred as well. So I'm just throwing out there to you that, when people come and go in your life, you have to acknowledge that and hopefully prepare for that. So when you go, you've done the best based on other people and, the fact that they're not there and the fact that your life is better now because of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that goes back to what Marlene was sharing as well, right? Is that you have to take the steps before it occurs so that not only are you prepared, but the people that are involved, the people that love you, the people that are around you and supporting you through this time, that they're also prepared, right? So great stuff, guys. Real quick, Let's shift to the last part, which is the actual equation to conquering these fears. Now, we're not going to be able to go into a ton of depth because we only have about 12 minutes left. But if you have particular or specific questions or fears that you want to work through, feel free to shoot me a text, shoot me an email, whatever it is, and I'd be more than happy to dive deeper. But these are the 3 steps to get you started. So step number 1 is isolate the fear. We talked a little bit about this at the beginning. When you are going through a certain situation, we all have emotional interpretations, right? So for example, Jack and I could go through the identical situation, everything the same, and have completely different interpretations about what occurred, right? So when we say isolate the fear, what we're really saying is not just to isolate the one particular fear, because you'll notice, for example, you might be experiencing the fear of poverty and the fear of criticism all at the same time. You want to isolate the fear itself. Once you can isolate the fear, now that's why I really like these broad concepts of these fears, because the fear of poverty, well, that's not specific to your exact example right now, but that is the umbrella that encompasses the fear of poverty. So you isolate that fear. You identify what the fear is. This is going to require somebody else with you. But the next step is you want to take that fear and you want to conjure up all the memories that you have or the emotional interpretations that we've reinforced and isolate them. You've got to have somebody with you that is going to help bring the awareness here, because as everybody on this call probably saw, previous calls that we were on, very joyful, happy, upbeat. This one, very emotional, right? Because it's fear-based and it brings up anxiety, doubt, worry. Those are tough things to face. So step 1, you must isolate the fear. When we say isolate the fear, you've got to pick just the one umbrella. So one of these 6 categories, that's what I mean by umbrella. So fear of death, for example. Okay, great. You isolate that fear. And then Marlene, just as an example, well, Marlene, very real life, just experienced this. So this is very relevant to her. So when we say isolate the fear, she's got a firsthand memory that she can go directly to. That is that's what we want to do. We want to take the fear and then get to the memory. Okay, part 2. When we say pattern recognition, I feel like this group has a really good grasp on this because Jack mentioned it, Bob mentioned it, we talked about it earlier, but that loop. So when we say pattern recognition, it is, okay, is this something that just occurred? Is this a one-off thing? The fear of health. Okay, tore the rotator cuff in this particular moment. I very well understand that that is relevant to my injury. It's not always there. Whereas the fear of death, that might always be there, right? So pattern recognition is having the self-awareness to identify the patterns, the habits, or like we talked about last time, the paradigm that you're operating in. This is going to take a lot of effort. This is not going to happen overnight. You've got to realize however old you are, that's how many years you've been supporting this fear. There's no real way to just crumble that structure in a night. It's not going to happen. It takes repetition and work to conquer these. Because again, if you're 50 years old, you've been supporting these beliefs for 50 years. Got to understand that. So that pattern recognition is, when we go through this, we're not yet solving the problem, right? What we're saying is, okay, we've isolated the fear. We've conjured up the memory and spent time analyzing that. Now we've recognized the pattern. We recognize that we're continuously doing this in other fronts, okay? Well, for example, maybe the fear of criticism is a big one. So every time I get into a networking group, I don't open my mouth. That is the pattern. Why? Because I fear criticism. Well, what does that come from? Oh, well, there was this one memory that occurred when I was in 2nd grade, and I built my entire belief structure and identity off of that memory. Happens all the time, more than you'd understand. So not more than you'd understand, more than you probably would imagine. So you isolate the fear, you recognize the pattern. Now we have to face it. Again, that is really getting to the root. And when we say getting to the root, it is to reduce emotion and look at fact. We're facing the fact. Here's a great example. When I was younger, my mom was horrified of bridges. We used to travel the Bay Bridge often, which is in Maryland, right? Very long bridge. It's like several miles long. You go over the ocean the whole time. She was horrified of this bridge. So much to the point that it was like a routine. If we ever came near a bridge, we had to put all the windows down. Everybody unbuckled their seatbelt because my mom was terrified the bridge was going to collapse. True story. My whole life, I held on to this because of the paradigm. And so I thought that I had a fear of heights because of this. So up until I was about 13 years old, I was terrified of heights. Never went on a plane before that. All of these opportunities I missed out on. One day, I was like, okay, let me isolate the fear. I'm afraid of heights. Where does that come from? The pattern recognition. I realized this is coming from the environment of being with my mom. And every time we came to a bridge, that worry and doubt rose up. So we created habits, which was putting the windows down, taking off our seatbelts. Well, now I've got to face the fear. So what I did in this exact situation, I went and jumped off a 60-foot cliff into water, right? I had to face the fear of looking down in that water and having not only no clue how I was going to get out, but facing the very real breath escaping my lungs and just being horrified and trembling, right? But after I did that jump, that became one of my favorite pastimes. And I actually ended up literally going around the world, finding some of my most favorite cliffs to jump off of. I've got an actual video on my Facebook you can pull up of me jumping off a 55-foot cliff in this tiny little like cup-sized pool in Hawaii. I did this in South America, all over the place. It became one of my favorite things. So in your fear, you want to go through this list, right? And you take whatever it is that is relevant to you right now, whether it's the fear of poverty, the fear of criticism, poor health, loss of love, old age, or death. Isolate just one. Don't try to do all these. Don't try to solve your whole life. Just pick one, guys. And my challenge to everybody on this call is to pick one of your fears today, one that really hit home when people were talking and you had that memory that just hasn't left you since we've been on this call. Take that fear and run it through this process. Isolate it. Get to the memory and see all the patterns that you've done, the habits that you've done to reinforce this fear. And then you've got to face it. You've got to face it head on. If it is the fear of criticism, if you don't want to be judged, go do exactly what you are afraid of. And tell me and tell the group how much power and strength that gives you. Don't focus on the fear and the emotions that are elicited before doing the act. Go do the act. Think about the feeling and the strength that you will gain after doing it. And that's what's going to pull you across the finish line. So any questions or comments, anything that anybody would like to share here? I know this is some heavy stuff, guys, but I'd love to hear some feedbacks or thoughts before we wrap up. We got about 3 minutes left.
I'll share.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to say this is one of like my favorite topics. And I feel like Keegan and I have worked a lot, like done a bunch of different exercises, kind of addressing these fears. And there were times when I thought he was like trying to torture me and just like be mean to me by making me like do these exercises. But then I really like leaned into it, and I just wanted to encourage everyone, like it's super uncomfortable, but there's so much power in conquering your fears. And even if you're just able to identify like, oh, I'm living in this specific fear, like that's the best place to start. You know what I mean? Like you're now aware. Wait, baby, you're now aware, and you can know that like that's the filter you're using in specific situations, and you can change it. Like you have the power to change it. And like that to me is just like the coolest thing, to know that it's in your hands and you can make the change.
Beautiful, Ashley. I really like what you said there. It's almost like the lens in which we see the world. right? These fears, these interpretations, it's the lens in which we see the world. We see the world through our limitations. And that's what these fears are. They're limitations. We all have them though. Like there's not one person on this call that doesn't face fear on a daily basis, by the way. This isn't like I'm not special. I face all these fears just like you guys do. We all do. That's part of human nature, right? So I love that, Ash. And you know, we won't get personal, but some of the stuff that Ashley has gone through in the last 2 years are very, very heavy rooted in fear, like some real serious stuff. And to go from that place and being trapped under that victimhood mentality to not only having power and strength over your fears, but now using them as your strengths, using them as your story to change other people's lives. That's the ultimate progression of conquering a crisis. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else? Anything else that you want to give feedback or thoughts before we close out, guys? Awesome. Well, look,
Awesome job, Keegan. Awesome job. It was awesome. I'm definitely going to be diving into some things that have been reoccurring, and I appreciate you. Thank you.
I love it, brother. I love it. So that's, you know, I appreciate it, Jack, but this is the challenge to everybody. Look, guys, the truth is often we go through situations like this. You guys just invested an hour here. Get something out of it. Make your time worthwhile. What do I mean? I mean, just take one fear from today's lesson, just one. And whether you talk about it with me or your best friend or Buddha, I don't care. Whoever it is, the tooth fairy, it doesn't matter. Just take that fear and get started. Because look, just like Ashley said, even the process of identifying and isolating just one fear, just that alone gives you power over it. And then guess what? You get to reduce that loop. You get to reduce the emotional tie to it. So my challenge to everybody is get just one done today. If you need any help or want feedback, please feel free to reach out. I love you guys so much. Thank you for all the vulnerability and truths today. Have an amazing Tuesday.
Thank you,
All right,
everyone. Great session, Keegan. Love you.
Love you guys. Thank
Take
you.
care, y'all.
Bye.